Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hi, this is Henry Gilroy, co-executive producer of Star Wars Rebels. You're listening to Aggressive Negotiations.
Hello and welcome to Aggressive Negotiations. I am just one of your hosts here, Matthew Rushing, coming at you from Why Are We Back on Jakku? Nobody wants to be here. But again, I'm just one of the hosts, and, well, the guy responsible for us being here, John Mills.
You know, I know that you're very critical, but I'm prospecting right now. I really think that there's going to be a high commodities market in sand, so I want to just stake as large an area of Jakku as I can and start selling this stuff. We got a whole planet full of it.
It gets everywhere.
That's true. It does.
And all we've got around here are those bloody pecker birds. I hate those things.
Well, what about those big pack what were they called again? The big pack animals?
The Hapivores?
Yeah, I need to know. I should know that because we're going to be living on Jakku mining sand for a while.
Well, I'm so excited that we are here. It's going to be a ton of fun tonight. We've got a great topic for you, I think. Before we get into that, though, if you want to find us anywhere, you can find us anywhere because we're wherever you get your podcasts. In fact, John, did you know that we're on Spotify now?
We're on Spotify? That's amazing.
Yeah. So you can get the Nerd Party shows over on Spotify, which means that Aggressive Negotiations is over there. So honestly, now, even more places to find us. If you are on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, give us a star rating review, help people find the show. Honestly, we say that every week, and this is the reason. The majority of people still listen through an Apple device and through Apple Podcasts and or iTunes. That's where people are still getting their podcasts for the most part, and it's where people discover most of their podcasts. So giving us a star rating review if you like the show, if you like what we do, let people know, and then, hey, we'll thank you on the show. We'll read out your review. You also want to make sure that you're following us on Twitter at The Jedi Masters. You also want to follow the entire network at Join Nerd Party. We've got the Facebook at facebook.com/The Nerd Party, and then we're online at thenerdparty.com. And then, maybe you have a thought or a question or something, and you'd like to share that with John and I. You can always go to thenerdparty.com/contact, choose a show, choose Aggressive Negotiations, and an email will come to John and I, and we can talk to you that way.
And we would be happy to, for sure.
Absolutely, we would be happy to. Now, we have, the last few weeks we talked about Poe, and we've talked a little bit about
droid sentience.
Sentience and everything, and then we were over on the 602 Club, and we talked about together Resistance, the first few episodes that were out, and that got me kind of going back, and I decided to go back and finish up the Poe Dameron comic series because the conversation we had about Poe made me want to go back. And Volume 4, there is a whole section with Lor San Tekka. There's this bit where he is on Cato Nemonia, and he's not really robbing. He just wants to inspect this thing, which he says has been crafted by both the dark and light sides of the Force and clearly designed to be operated by both at once. And he can only imagine what its purpose is. And then later on, he is talking to the Nemoidians because he gets caught stealing this. Not stealing it, but trying to look at it because the guy who owns it didn't want him looking at it.
To borrow
let
it.
him take a look at it. He just wanted to take a look at it. So he's kind of explaining what it is and why he was looking at this. And he says that he just wanted to examine it and that it might imply a chapter of the grand history of the Force when the light and the dark were not in opposition but united.
Mm-hmm.
And so what got me thinking is this idea of, is Lor San Tekka onto something? This thought of maybe maybe the light and the dark, instead of being in opposition, need to come together and get their stuff together and just stop all the fighting and start the loving.
Love is the answer, I guess. It's really an interesting question because it's very tempting, I think, especially because so many of us have spent so many years pondering and debating the nature of the Force. And, of course, Lucas opened up a whole ton of different pathways you could explore and debate, which is just one of the most beautiful things, I think, about that Yoda arc in the Clone Wars, of course, that we've talked about. But also, just if you look just at the main theatrically released episodic films, there's a lot about the Force that is touched on but not gone into too deeply. It's definitely a conversation starter. And I think that it's very interesting to see Lor San Tekka pursuing this because of his first line in The Force Awakens, is saying that the Jedi have to return in order for there to be balance. Does this play into that? Does this teach him some sort of lesson? My reaction to this scene is it's a trap. Because anything that touches on the dark side is not to be messed with. There's a reason it's called the dark side. I get we're dealing with a Manichaean thing where it's like the light and the dark being in balance and everything like that. But there's a difference between working together and being on a level playing field, being in balance.
Yeah, this is really interesting because it's not something that is unknown to Star Wars fans, because in the novels at the end of the New Jedi Order series, there's this thing that comes out, the idea of the unifying force, that there is neither dark nor light, it's just what you do with the Force that makes it dark or light. And so it becomes about intent then. So you could use, say, Force lightning, but it's about the intent behind it, of why you're using that. And so, it's interesting to me that Lor San Tekka would talk about this idea that they need to be united. There's also a point later on in the comic where he talks about how the Force is almost like the ocean, where it comes in waves. Like there will be moments when the Force is just very strong, like full tide is in, and then it kind of retreats. Which, it to me it seems like an idea of, okay, why you're just trying to explain the idea of the Force Awakens.
Right. Yes. It's a little too on the nose.
Right. And so, but this whole thing has me wondering because, it comes down to what we think of then the Force. Is the Force, is the dark and the light, are they really not all that different? And the question that I come to then is how could they not be different when all the aims that we see of people who have used the dark side of the Force tend to be something that is selfish and self-serving and disregards everybody else but themselves. And what we normally know of the light side of the Force is that it is selflessness, and it's basically the harder road. And so it makes me wonder, how would you then bring them together when they're really on opposite... I mean, they really are on opposite sides.
Well, I think you hit on it, because you're talking about how they said, the difference is intent. So I think that it's important in a discussion like this not to wind up conflating an argument about the power that you're using, the specific ability that is manifesting, although I would present to you that we have right there in the text of Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, bad Force user throw lightning, good Force user catch, deflect, and dissipate Force lightning. And it is one of those things where the unifying, there's the living Force, and then there's the cosmic Force, And so in the strictest sense of the term, the Force is the Force. The Force, you're right, doesn't have a negativity about it or anything. It simply is the energy field created by all living beings. But if intent does play into it, there's a reason it's called the dark side, is because it indicates somebody that is like Palpatine or the Witches of Dathomir that are using this, if you will, neutral force toward their end. And that even plays into, what I know that I tend to throw a flag on pulling in outside sources from time to time, but even Lucas talks about how even on that metaphysical level that there are beings fighting out the battle between the light and the dark, and that we're the chess pieces sort of thing.
It really made me think about, how this would be possible, because I think it comes down to the idea that light and dark and how they would work together, it becomes about the idea of what we think of as balance, and we've talked about that before. Of what does balance mean in the Star Wars universe? And again, kind of the understanding that I feel like that I've gotten from Star Wars and from George is that balance to him is not about there being a balance between dark and light per se, but that the light keeps darkness minimal or at bay.
Well, again, this is the difficult territory. Is again, it's finding that new path. Was Luke at the end of Return of the Jedi? Is acknowledging that you can't be overly disciplined, dogmatic people like the Jedi, and you can't be controlling, self-serving people like the Sith. There is a possibility to exist as a person with that balance inside of you. Recognize, sort of like the journey that Spock goes on, where it's not just logic and it's not just emotion, it's a perfect fusion of the two. It's understanding the role of both, of reason and instinct, and not favoring one over the other, but finding that right plateau. And I think, it's important to say, this doesn't mean that Lor San Tekka is right. This is just what motivates him. And so he could be, pursuing his own interpretation of things. But I think that the discussion of having the Force in balance should be focused more on the Force users understanding the role of these conflicting sides within themselves and resolving that, as opposed to trying to catalog what aspect of the Force is naughty and which aspect of the Force is nice. It's about you being in balance, and therefore the Force can properly act through you. Like Obi-Wan says, you mean it controls your actions partially, but it also obeys your commands. Just like the midichlorians, there's a symbiotic relationship between you and the Force in the Star Wars galaxy, and you have to be in balance for the Force's will to be acted upon you appropriately.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting aspect of that whole idea. One, obviously, you get towards the idea of that there is a will of the Force. So there is this a part of the Force that desires, it seems, to have something happen, and it works to make it happen. How that works is something that George never fully got into, and it did seem like he had that conversation with James Cameron. He had ideas about how that worked in his universe, which I think would have been quite fascinating to figure out. But you also, I think, you were touching on something that's really interesting, finding the balance within yourself. And I was thinking through the characters that we've seen throughout the stories, and I feel like, again, and we've mentioned this before, but I think it really bears repeating in this episode as we're talking about this. I feel like one of the very few characters who has been able to do that has been Kanan.
Yes.
Kanan learned how to know himself well enough by the end to pull himself out of areas in which he may be compromised.
Right.
And therefore, putting Ezra in charge of that mission to save Hera, because he knew that there was a part of him that would do whatever it took to try and save her instead of the rest of the mission, and therefore he couldn't be the one to be in charge of it. And I think what you're talking about, this idea of self-awareness, then for anyone using the Force to understand what and why they are using it, and learn to temper those desires and those uses to ones that aren't self-serving. And the whole problem with this is that I can see how it can become very easy to get caught up in using the Force and stop thinking about that kind of thing. I can see how that could become almost like an addiction.
Yeah, and to bring it back to Lor San Tekka, I do think this is important as well. Is that it's nice to be getting more detail on him, because it always seemed puzzling to me that you would have Max Von Sydow in such a minor role. It always seemed to me that his presence indicated a desire for greater weight to who he was and what he meant to the story. And what I think would be interesting to explore here is Lor San Tekka's actions being part of what spurs certain things into existence or into play. Like, is there a hint about Snoke's background here? Because we have here another obsession with artifacts. We have, even in Solo, we have Sith artifacts everywhere with Dryden Voss. We know from the original Lando short series, that the Emperor was obsessed with artifacts. Kylo Ren is obsessed with artifacts. We have a character in Bloodline that's obsessed with artifacts.
Well, and just to add on top of that, in the Darth Vader comic right now, in the latest run, there is a Sith artifact. It's a helmet that is somehow somewhat imbibed with the spirit of the one who wore it, and he was a Sith architect, Sith artist, and that's where we're getting through that is that's where the Darth Vader's castle comes from. So yeah, artifacts are playing a huge part in this part of, so just Disney canon in general.
So
really.
Is the thing that we should be looking at not just that Lor San Tekka's view of the Force might be a little bit misguided in terms of, if anything, maybe it's a reflection of the audience misinterpreting balance of the Force to mean, the Force itself is in balance. We're talking about balance of the people using it is what we should be, talking about. And so Lor San Tekka basically becomes a stand-in for, Star Wars fans through the years and their attempts to understand, this big cosmic mystery. But I think maybe this is a bigger clue about the artifacts again, because even going to and forgive me for forgetting the name of it, but it was the one-shot comic with the side character from The Force Awakens, the female dressed in black with the
Bazine Natal.
Yes, her one-shot had to do with her going and stealing an artifact.
Yep.
So maybe what we're finding out here is another breadcrumb, because one of the big questions is who's Snoke, where does he come from, and how is he so darn powerful? Maybe it's this artifact quest is that he was either a part of Lor San Tekka's quest and opened one of these artifacts, got corrupted, channeled its power, or maybe he used Lor San Tekka at sort of the way Belloc used Indiana Jones. Maybe Lor San Tekka is like the Indiana Jones where he's going out and he's raiding the temples and he's finding these things, and then Belloc comes behind. Once again, there's nothing that you possess that I cannot take away. And maybe that's Snoke's way of going through and just sniffing out the things that he needs for his power. So Lor San Tekka's interpretation of the Force is important in the sense that it drives him to look for these things, but these things are what has spurred the story.
And I think what to me, what that says as well is that there's so much about the Force then and the idea of like objects and how they can hold special meaning in the Force and become imbibed, with the Force that that's a whole new side of things that we haven't necessarily truly ever explored, which is kind of interesting. I mean, and again, like that Vader comic where you've got this helmet that has some sort of power, and it's somehow linked to a Sith Lord from the past. But how all that works is interesting because we know the Sith can't truly be immortal. So
here's a thought, and I know that this is sort of a trademark tangent sort of thing, but we're sitting here talking about artifacts and looking for things from the past. There's almost a meta layer about what one of the criticisms of the sequel trilogy has been, is about looking backward instead of present or forward. Maybe there's even an unintentional story layer here that I think ties in nicely, actually, to the First Order and why the Republic falls, is everybody's looking backward. They're looking in the wrong direction for how to live their lives and where to get their inspiration and power, and they should be looking forward, or at least in the present. Maybe this is another nice read we could layer on top of things to, sort of like build up the layer cake of the sequel trilogy.
Well, and, that's something that, we talked about with the Poe show, which rhymes, and the whole idea of the fact that why would Leia be pouring into this dude? What would she be trying to teach him? And the idea that she would be trying to teach him to move on from the past and not repeat the mistakes, learn from the past, and basically do what kind of Rey comes to at the end of the Last Jedi, which is you take from the past what was good and you leave in the past what was bad, and you find a way to move forward and forge a new future. And maybe that's where it all comes together, that that's the thing. Just like you said, we've been kind of trying to just rebuild the glories of the past, and what we need to do is find what it means to be in the future.
And another thought that I just had was it isn't even necessarily Snoke or just Snoke that ties in with Lor San Tekka's quest. We know that Lor San Tekka knows Ben Solo from before he was Kylo Ren, meaning he knows Leia. What if the way that, and I don't know if anything's been written that contradicts this or not. I'm not up to date on all of the books or anything, but wouldn't it be amazing if we found out that part of what corrupts Ben is Lor San, like he goes off with Lor San Tekka. Luke doesn't want to train Jedi, so Leia sends him off with Lor San Tekka. Hey, he's Church of the Force or whatever. Go off with him for a little while. And that's how he comes into possession of Vader's helmet. And that's what corrupts him.
Yeah. I mean, I think you do have I think what this really brings me to this whole idea that we have all of these artifacts out there, and some of them have power, seem to have power, and some of them seem to be able to have influence over the people. I mean, absolutely. Maybe, like, remember in Harry Potter where Dumbledore puts on the Horcrux ring because he doesn't realize it's a Horcrux or he does, but I mean, anyway, it's in the Half-Blood Prince.
Yeah.
He puts it on, and it basically, he's holding off death all year because it is slowly killing him.
Yes.
And so what if that's what happened to Snoke? Maybe that's why he looks like he does too. Maybe he put on something that deformed him, but also made him who he is in the dark side.
That would be, that was his trade-off, was he got the power, but it messed him up.
I got the power!
Yeah.
He even played that song, while he got deformed.
Wouldn't that be great if he came on screen to that?
Well, and what's kind of fascinating about that is when you think about it, it does mirror what happened to Palpatine.
Yeah.
So, there is that, and it's not a one-for-one.
Right.
Either. But it has a nice mirroring effect towards what happened to Palpatine, and I think it's actually, it's the kind of mirroring that you would want because it's not a one-for-one.
Right. It's its own thing, but
right.
It rhymes. To borrow
Yeah,
the phrase
it does.
from
It
Lucas.
has a familiarity, which brings us to something that we know, but it's not quite the same. And so, I think that would be really fascinating. And so, it would be, to me, this is something that we kind of have slowly learned about other Force religions. We have the Church of the Force, which we know Lor San Tekka is a part of. But we don't have tons of information. And so, it's so fascinating to me because I feel like as we've been discussing, like last week we got so in discussing Poe and what was going on with him and with Leia and everything. Like, I think what we're discovering is, again, there is, so when you really put your mind to all that we know from Star Wars before the sequel trilogy, and even a lot of the things that say we're getting in the sequel trilogy, and it's not really just the films. Honestly, what we're kind of finding is I think most of these nuggets are really coming from the ancillary materials.
Yeah, Charles Soule seems to be producing a lot of these things along with the other comic book writers. Yeah. But we know that they're working in conjunction with the story group. We're not being dismissive of their efforts here. We're recognizing that they are naturally a part of this, and they would not, because things are supposedly finely tuned enough that they wouldn't be able to put this in the comic without it being, a blessed part of the franchise sort of thing. So
exactly, which I think, there's this sense that if you were to find a way to truly pull all this together, you could really make this into something.
Yeah.
And as I do feel like, I'll never be able to not feel like this, is that The Last Jedi is a misstep for me. But I think story-wise, still, when I look towards 9, this is what I get somewhat excited about, is that when I'm looking at all of these story ideas, you really can make this mean something. You can make this good.
Right.
You can make this really make sense and be something that does end up adding to the Star Wars mythology in a way that keeps us talking for the next 20, 30 years.
Right, exactly. And I think we would be talking for the next 20 or 30 years anyway. I mean, it's hard to remember the time before the prequels and stuff like that, but there was plenty of fertile ground where there were questions we did have that weren't answered. Mm-hmm. And we did just fine, and we managed with them. But at the same time, to speak to your point, I think that there is a tremendous opportunity that one of the things that I expect to be followed up on is, because if you remember, I mean, this artifacts thing was being hinted at and used in materials leading up to The Force Awakens. And it was a thing in The Force Awakens with Vader's helmet. And now it's coming back again in the comics. I fully expect there has to be something else. Even Anakin's saber / Luke's saber is an artifact that has something to it. So I do expect this to be something that continues and plays a role in 9.
Well, and I think, that makes for a really fascinating thing with just even thinking of the lightsaber, in the fact that, it's... What does that crystal go on to inform what Rey will create as her lightsaber? Does she go and, does she end up traveling to Tatooine and going back to Ben's hovel and finding the remains of lost Jedi kyber crystals there? Does she go on a mission to find her own kyber crystal? So, I mean, there's so many amazing stories you could tell that have to do with artifacts. But when it comes to this idea of artifacts, I really do like your thought that the possibility of maybe it would be interesting to see something like, instead of, Rey having a lightsaber that's been handed down to people, that she does create something new.
Mm-hmm.
That it represents the start of something new, and that we are letting go of the past in the best ways, but holding on to the past in the best ways. And I think there is such an opportunity here to tell a story that really could kind of blow our minds with 9 and what they could do with Star Wars Resistance, and the one they continue to do with the ancillary materials as well, all around the sequel trilogy, because there really is so much to fill in. I mean, think of the 30 years we've got that we still know almost nothing about, So there's a lot you can do.
The one question I want to ask is, are we in dangerous territory as fans to pick up on this series of panels? And like the great debate we've always had is, are we going to see any of this expressed in the films? Or are we only going to have, because how much are we going to rely on this, and how much of this can be overwritten? Because we've had several retoolings of the expanded universe through time. And so how much of this is to be permanent?
That's a really good question. I think that we all ask that question because it really does come down to, when push comes to shove, are you really going to give the book that was written and the up over what somebody wants to do with a movie,
right?
Or a TV show? And I do think that's always the personally, let me put it this way, always in my mind, there is the thought when I'm reading any, Star Wars book that's not just a novelization, is that this is always going to be a secondary canon, in the sense that if it did come to a shoving match, a movie or a TV show is going to win, because, the books make money, but they don't make movie money.
Right, exactly.
So,
the books are there just to satisfy the fans. And so are the artifacts nothing more than Lor San Tekka's obsession?
Mm-hmm. Well, and see, this is something, I mean, like you said, this goes all the way back to The Force Awakens. It goes all the way back to the original Aftermath book. Remember, the Acolytes of the Beyond were after Sith lightsabers? That's
right. They were.
So, I mean, this is something that we have seen planted from the very beginning. So, I really do get what you're saying. Are we getting our hopes up by being fans and thinking through this stuff too much, and then when we get to the movie, we're going to be disappointed because it's nowhere to be found.
Right.
But I do feel like some of this is something that's been there for so long so far in this new canon that it seems like you've got to have a thought process for it somewhere. And, the reason that I'm maybe a little bit more hopeful is that, JJ, who started it all, is going to end it all. with the episodes. And so his thought of and we've heard referenced out there that he said that he wants this to bring all of the trilogies together. And what better way to do that than use artifacts from the past in a way that honors the future.
Yeah. Yeah, so, okay. So, yeah, no, you're helping me reset there because since it is so mindful and it is so intent-driven, the artifacts idea had faded a little bit, and to see it come back probably does carry some sort of at least minor meaning about what we're going to get. That makes sense.
I mean, I would think so, especially when you... Well, I think your thought process of the fact that so many people are looking to the past. I mean, obviously, even Kylo Ren says it in Force Awakens. I will finish what you have started. This idea of completing the work of the past,
right?
And and so this balance of past and future with where we are in the present, I think that's also a great theme for Star Wars in general.
Yeah.
I think that's the kind of theme that is worthy of Star Wars. So because it is timeless, and if they can pull that off, I think it'd just be fantastic. I'd be very happy.
And we can all point back to these panels with Lor San Tekka and say, we saw it coming.
Or we could just all point back to the aggressive negotiations and say, called it.
Yes, exactly. Or you can look back and say, they're nuts.
Yeah. Or you're going to be listening to the show in the future and you're going to be like, what the hell are they talking about?
Yeah. Boy, were they wrong. Nobody thought that the Ewoks were the key to the Force.
No, it's actually the Gunkins.
Oh,
so.
I would... Seriously, I can't offer money to J.J. Abrams, but I would find some artifact in the Batcave here. I'd be like, if you make that happen, this is yours.
Well, if anybody wanted to catch up with you, John, and because they liked some of our theories, and they wanted to talk to you, where might they be able to find you out there in the social media ether?
Well, in the social media ether, I'm floating around in a perfect balance between light and dark as Kessel Junkie. Typically, you're going to find me on Twitter, but I am starting to write more reviews on Letterboxd and Goodreads. And, of course, I'm out there on different various projects. The best way to stay plugged into that stuff is by following Kessel Junkie on Twitter. And I hope to see you there. If you do decide to come over and take a look, please let me know, and I will gladly exchange notes with you. But that's how you get in touch with me. Also, the Nerd Party has just released a new show called Retro Perspective. And it is a show that is going to be focused on short-term series looking at franchises, film director histories, and those sorts of things. So looking back over the body of work of a creator, or possibly looking at a franchise and seeing where it went through. And to kick that off, myself and Matt Hansen did a retro perspective series on the Halloween films, the original Halloween films, since we just got the new sequel. So go on over and check out Retro Perspective, and you'll hear me over there talking about a film series that arguably had as much of an influence on me as Star Wars. So, given all of that, if they want to...
that explains a lot.
Doesn't it, though? If they want to commune
it really
with
does.
The unifying force, Matt, and find their own balance, where can they find you online, you little scamp?
Well, you can find me balancing on the tip of a lightsaber in perfect union with all living things on Twitter, MattRushing02. You can also find me on Instagram in the same name. I use Letterboxd as well. Unfortunately, I can't change my name, but it's MRushing02 there. So I wish that I had thought through the process of making everything unified like you did. I'm just not as smart as you are. So you can also find me here on the network doing Outpost with Trey Kaufman, talking all about Harry Potter one chapter at a time. We're actually almost done with the Goblet of Fire, which is so cool. We've only got like 2 chapters left, which is insane. So make sure you check out that show. It's a real blast, especially as we're about to hit the new Fantastic Beasts film that's coming up. So, Harry Potter is going to be back in the news. You can also find me over on the Trek FM network doing The Orb with Chris Jones as we talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And you can also find me doing the 602 Club. We talked about that here. We do cover pretty much every franchise we can over there. It's a lot of fun. We have shows for everyone. Pretty much if you have a fandom, we've probably covered something in it. And then last but not least, doing cinema stories with my good friend Courtney as we talk about films through the lens of faith. But, John, I'm a little winded after all that, so I think there's only one thing left to say. I think it's time to close negotiations.
Matt, this artifact says negotiations are closed.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.